Hey guys, welcome to this channel. In this session, I'm going to talk about AWS RDS. So if you will found this video helpful, then share this video with your friend. And if you are new, then don't forget to subscribe this channel. So let's get started with an overview of AWS RDS. RDS stands for Relational Database Service. And what it means is that it's a managed database service for databases that use SQL as a query language. So SQL is a structured language to query database. It's very well adapted and it's running on many engines. So it allows you to create databases, the RDS service in the cloud, and these databases will be managed by AWS and you get a lot of benefit from it. So what type of database engine are managed by AWS? Well, the first one is PostgreSQL. Then we have MySQL, MariaDB, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, and finally Aurora. And we have a dedicated section to Aurora. So right now you can just forget about it, okay? But so the first five, Postgres, MySQL, MariaDB, Oracle, and Microsoft SQL Server, you have to remember them. So why would we use RDS versus deploying our own database service on top of, say, an EC2 instance? Because this is possible. Well, RDS is a managed service. As such, AWS provides a lot of service on top of just giving us a database. For example, the provisioning of the database is fully automated, and so is the underlying operating system patching. There is continuous backups being made and you are able to restore to a specific timestamp. It's called point-in-time restore. You can also have monitoring dashboard to view the performance of your database. You can have read replicas. It provides enhanced performance and durability of RDS database instance. You can set up a multi-AZ that will be helpful for disaster recovery. You have maintenance window for the upgrades and you have scaling capabilities, both vertical by increasing the instance type and horizontal by adding read replicas. Finally, the storage is backed by EBS. So this is something we already know, which is GP2, volume or IO1. But the only thing we do not have is we cannot SSH into the instances, the RDS instances. So because this is managed service, AWS provides us a service and we don't have access to the underlying EC2 instance. But this is not too bad because we get all these things that we would have to set up on our own if we wanted to deploy our own database engine on EC2. So let's talk about RDS backup for a little bit. Backups are automatically enabled in RDS and you have automated backups. They are daily full backups for the database which are done during the maintenance window that you define. And then the transaction logs, the daily transaction logs are backup by RDS every 5 minutes. So these three things together gives you the ability to restore to any point in time your database from the oldest backup all the way to what happened up to 5 minutes ago. There is a 7 days retention of these automated backups by default, but it can be increased to 35 days. And you have database snapshots. So snapshots are slightly different from backups. Snapshots are backups that are manually triggered by the user, and the backups retention. So this snapshot retention is as long as you want, so they are more helpful if you wanted to retain the state of your database for 6 months at same point in time. So here is one feature that can come up in the exam. and is around RDS storage auto scaling. So the idea is that when you create an RDS database, you need to say how much storage you want. For example, you want 20 gigabyte of storage, but say you are using your database a lot and you are about to run out of free space. Then with this feature enabled, the RDS storage autoscaling, RDS will detect that and will scale automatically the storage for you, so you don't have to do any kind of operations such as taking down your database to increase the storage. So the idea is that your application does a lot of read and writes to your RDS database, and then automatically with some threshold we will see in a second, then the storage can auto scale, and that is a feature of RDS. That is very nice feature. So this all is meant to make you avoid the operation of scaling manually your database storage. For this, you need to set a maximum storage threshold. Set the maximum limit for how much you want the storage to grow, because you don't want it to grow infinitely maybe. And you can automatically modify storage if the free storage is less than 10% of what has been allocated and the low storage has been lasting for more than 5 minutes and 6 hours have passed since the last modification. If that's the case, then the storage will auto increase when you enable it. This is very helpful for applications that have unpredictable workload, and this supports all database engines for RDS such as MariaDB, MySQL, PostgreSQL, SQL Server and Oracle. So if you are preparing for the exam, then it's very important to understand the difference between RDS replicas and multi-AZ and understand exactly the use cases for those. So this lecture is really dedicated to understand read replicas and multi-AZ. So first, let's get started with the read replicas. Read replicas, as the name indicates, it helps you to scale your reads. So let's have an example. Here we have our application and we have an RDS database instance, and our application performs reads and writes to our database instance. But say we want to scale the reads because that main database instance cannot scale enough. It receives too many requests. Well, we can create up to 5 read replicas, and they can within the same availability zone, cross availability zone or cross region. So 3 different options, and they are very important to remember. So say we have another RDS instance read replica and another one, and what will happen is that there will be an asynchronous replication between the main RDS database instance and the 2 read replicas. Asynchronous, that means that the reads are eventually consistent. What that means is that, for example, if your application reads from the read replica before they had the chance to replicate the data, then you may get old data, and this is why it's called eventually consistent asynchronous replicant. And these replicas, they can be awesome for reading for scaling reads, but they can also be promoted to their own database. So you can take one of these replicas and say, okay, I want it to be its own database now, and take writes. And so you promote it to its own database. It's completely out of the replication mechanism after that, but its leave as has its own life cycle afterward. So in case you wanna use read replicas, the main application in orange in the top of the screen must update the connection string to leverage the list of all the read replicas you have in your RDS cluster. Okay, so let's talk about classic use case for your read replicas. So in this example, we have a production database and it is taking on normal load. So here we go. Our production database is having a read and writes to our main RDS database instance. And the new team comes in and say, we want to run some reporting and some analytics on top of your data. And so if you plug in that reporting application onto the main RDS database instance, then it's going to overload it and possibly slow down the production application, and you don't want that. So instead, what you do as a solution architect is you create a read replica to run the new workload there. So you create a read replica. There is some asynchronous replication that happens between your main RDS DB instance and your read replica. And then your reporting application can just do reads from your read replica and run the analytics there. The production application is completely unaffected in that case, and that's perfect. So remember, if you have a read replica, you need to assure that it is only for select type of statements. And selects is a SQL keyword. Selects means read. And so you cannot use keywords such as insert, update or delete, which change database itself. Okay, read replicas is only for reads. So let's talk about the networking cost associated with RDS read replica. So in AWS, you should know that normally there is a cost when the data goes from one availability zone to another. But there are exceptions, and these exceptions are usually for managed service. So for RDS read replica, this is a managed service. If your read replica is within the same region, okay, different AZ but same region, you are not paying that fee. So what this means that if you have a RDS DB instance in US East 1A and then a read replica in US East 1B, and there is a asynchronized replication because this is a read replica, even though the traffic goes from one AZ to a different AZ, that replication traffic is going to be free because RDS is a managed service and they give you that traffic for free. But if you are using a cross-region replica, so for example, you are in one region US East 1 and you go to another region EU West 1, then your RDS DB instance and your read replica will have replication that will go across regions, and this will incur a replication fees for your network. So now finally let's talk about RDS multi-AZ. And multi-AZ is manually used for disaster recovery. So we have our application and it performs the reads and writes to our master database instance, which is in availability zone A, and what we think you have is a synchronous replication to a standby instance in AZB, and they will replicate every single change in the master synchronously. So that means that when your application writes to the master, the change need to also be replicated to the standby to be accepted. And so what we get out of it is one DNS name. So your application talks to one DNS name, and in case there is a problem with the master, there will be an automatic failover to the standby database thanks to that one DNS name. So thanks to this, we increase the availability. This is why it's called multi-AZ. And there will be failover in case we lose an entire AZ, or we lose the network, or there is an instance or storage failure for the master database, in which case obviously the standby database will become the new master. You don't need to do any manual intervention in your app as long as it tries to keep on connecting to your database. Automatically at some point it will fail over to the standby that will be promoted as the master and you will be good. And it's not used for scaling. So as you can see here, the standby database is just for standby. No one can read to it, no one can write to it. It's just here as a failover in case anything goes on with your master database. So quick question is there a possibility to have the read replicas being set up as multi-AZ for disaster recovery? And the answer is yes. You can set up your read replicas as multi-AZ if you wanted to. And that is a common exam question, okay? So that's it for the difference between read replicas and multi-AZ. But you need to absolutely understand this going into the exam because a lot of questions will go and be about it. So a question that can come up in the exam is around how do we make an RDS database go from single AZ to multi-AZ. So what you should know is that it is a zero downtime operation. That means you do not need to stop the database to go from single AZ to multi-AZ. The only thing you need to do is to click on modify for the database and enable multi-AZ. That means that your RDS database instance is going to go to have a master, to have a standby DB with synchronous replication without you doing anything except modifying that setting, and the database will not stop. Now this is what the exam will ask you, but I want to show you what will happen behind the scene for it to work. So the following will happen internally. There will be a snapshot taken by RDS automatically of your main database, and that the snapshot will be restored into a new standby database. Okay, and then once the standby database is restored, there will be synchronization established between the two databases. And so therefore the standby database will catch up to the main RDS database, and there you go, you will be in a multiple AZ setup. We saw what is Amazon RDS and what is the difference between RDS read replicas and multi-AZ. And as you all know, in this session I am going to give you full demonstration of Amazon RDS. Okay, so let's go ahead. As you can see, this is my management console, and now let's create a database with RDS. So RDS is going to be allowing us to get a managed database in the AWS cloud, and they get us a lot of goodness out of it because we don't have to manage the underlying server, and we get a lot of features such as backups, replicas, multi-AZ, and so on out of the box. So let's create a database, and as you can see in here, we have different options for creating a database. So we have the standard create to see all option and the easy create to go faster over it. But because we are learning AWS, let's go over the standard create option. So we have different engine types. We have Aurora, MySQL, MariaDB, PostgreSQL, Oracle, and Microsoft SQL Server. So Aurora we will see later on, and from these 5 engines you need to remember them all. So MySQL, MariaDB, PostgreSQL, Oracle, and Microsoft SQL Server. But for this demo we are going to use MySQL. And then in terms of version, just choose whether it's recommended here. Okay, so next one, MySQL, we have different option. So here are templates we can specify to meet our use case, which is going to be pre-filling some configuration parameter in here. So we have production, dev test or free tier. and because we want to see all the options, I'm going to choose production, and we are going to choose in the option one by one, but we will make sure to choose an instance that is compliant with using the free tier of AWS RDS. Okay, so for production we need to specify a database identifier. So database 1 is great. Then we need to specify a master username, so admin is perfect. Then a master password, and I will enter password just to make it very simple. Okay, we are good to go. Then I will scroll down to database class. Here we can choose the type of instance we want. So we have standard classes, optimized and bustable classes, and then you can choose the instance type, which is giving you a certain number of vCPU, RAM, as well as network speed. But we want to keep things in the free tier, so therefore let's go into bustable classes, and we need to include a previous generation and choose db2 micro. This is to make sure that you remain within the free tier of this hands-on. Next, for storage, we need to choose GP2, but we have different options. We have GP2, IO1 and magnetic. But to remain within the free tier yet again, we need to choose a general purpose SSD type. So GP2 is great with 20 GB of storage. Okay, next we have a very cool feature called storage auto scaling. So when we enable it, this provides dynamic scaling support for your database storage. So the more we use our storage, we close to 20 gigabytes, automatically the search will be increased by AWS without us doing anything. So this is again up/type of scaling, and we can specify a maximum storage threshold, for example 1000 gigabytes to 1 terabytes. This is very handy because we don't need to monitor the sort of size. We just know that it will automatically scale as the workload increase. Next, very important and cool, availability and durability. So we choose production templates, so it was enabled by default, but we can disable multi-AZ for this instance. So multi-AZ here is that if we did enable multi-AZ, we would get a standby instance for our RDS database, which is recommended for production usage, and this standby instance is going to be here for data redundancy in case you have IO freeze for backups and to minimize latency spikes during backups as well. So this is done by instance. It's not something that gets used by your application. It's something that is your here in case your main instance has an issue or a reboot or something like this. So for now we will disable multi-AZ, but this is where the setting would be. Next, for network setting, we launch it into RVPC. We have it when the specific certain group, and then we want public access. Yes, because we want to be able to connect to publicly to test our database in this hands-on. And VPC security group, we can create a new security group. I will call this one demo database MySQL. Okay, do we have a preference for AZ? No preference. And then the port is going to be the standard port of 3306. Next, for database authentication, we have three options. We have password authentication, password and IAM database authentication, and password and Kerberos authentications. So important to note the second option to use IAM credentials to log into RDS. But to keep things simple, I'm just going to use password authentications for this hands-on. And then we have a lot of additional configuration. So we can first, for example, specify the initial database name. Okay, if not, then let's just specify my DB. Some parameters groups which is out of scope for this, the backups. So do we want to have automatic backup? Yes. The backup retention period, so 7 days, but we can specify from 0 to 35 days. The backup window, so we could specify a specific window every day to backup, but no preference is fine. And hence monitoring, to get more metrics from your database. And do we want to export the logs into CloudWatch logs? We want to get the audit to the error, general or the slow query logs. The maintenance, so we want to enable auto minor version upgrades. Yes, as well as we want to specify the maintenance window for this. And do we want to enable deletion protection to prevent us from deleting the database accidentally? So I will keep this on. So again, this is estimated monthly cost, and so if we have chosen the T2 micro type of instance, this is within the free tier. Okay, but just so you know, you may have here some estimated monthly cost so as part of this UI. So when you are done, let's create this database. So while my database is being created, let's go ahead and download SQL Actron. And this is SQL client that we are going to use to connect to our database. So very simple, you are doing to click on download GUI and then click on it. Take the latest version for whatever platform you have. So you have latest Windows. So I'm going to do this one. Then simply we have to open it and install it and open. Okay, so my database is now created. It took a little bit of time, and now as you can see, it is available. And so what I'm going to show you are a few options. So first of all, we have the endpoint right here and the port 3306, and it's linked to the security group. And the security group, if you click on it and look at the inbound rules, we can see that we have an inbound rule here on TCP port 3306. So that's great. Okay, coming from the just my IP address. Okay, so you should of course modify this security group if you have problem connecting to your database instance, to maybe have it to anywhere IPv4. Okay, so now let's take these endpoints and we are going to connect to it using SQL Actron. So using SQL Actron, I'm going to add a new database. I'll call it RDS Demo. It's a database of type MySQL. And then for the server address, I'm going to enter what I have over here on port 3306. The user is admin and the password for me was password. And then the initial database is my DB as I entered it for before. Let's click on test and the connection is successful. If it's not successful, please have a look whether or not your database was set to be public database number 1, and number 2, have a look at your security group setting to make sure that your IP is allowed in. So let's save this and connect to our database. And now I am connected to my database directly into my DB, which was the database that was I created. And in here I could go ahead and enter some create table statement. So create my table and then just name of varchar 20 and first name of varchar 20. So it's just a very quick statement just to show you how SQL works. But this is definitely out of scope for the exam. Execute this. So now we have my table that has been created, and then we don't have any content in it, okay, but you could have an insert statement to insert some data into your table. So you would say, for example, enter the value Marek and then the value here Stefan. Execute this, and then if you click on select rows, then you can see that my table has my name and my first name to be Marek and Stefan. So this is how we would use the RDS database with MySQL. But again, out of scope of the exam, I just want to show you the full picture of using SQL Actron. So back in here, my RDS database is fully managed. So this is great. We can use it. Other things we can do that are worthy are to create a replica directly from the database. So we can create a replica, and then this replica would allow us to have more read capacity for our database, which will be very helpful. And do we want with our nodes that database should be multi-AZ for recovery purpose? So I'll keep it as no and cancel it. Next, we can have a look at monitoring. And monitoring, for example, we could trust its CPU utilization, and we can see while the CPU utilization is monitored by my database. And we can monitor this, for example, for scaling our database. If in case we have to make many connection into it, we can have a look at database connection counts as well to see how many clients are connected into our database and a lot of metrics overall. Okay, other things you can do with RDS is around creating snapshots. So you can take snapshot and this will snapshot your database and you can restore it whenever you want. You can restore to a point in time for your database, or you can even migrate a snapshot if you want to migrate a snapshot into a different region, for example. So all of these are bunch of options that we can use, but as we can see, the whole power of RDS is to manage the database for us to have replica as multi-AZ. We can increase the instance type as we go along and so on. And that's all come very handy from managed service perspective. So you have seen all you need to know for your RDS database. I hope you like it. And just to finish yourself, please make sure to delete the database. To delete it, first you need to remove the termination protection. So you go to modify, and then at the very bottom you will scroll down and find the delete protection setting. So here it is. We will disable it, press and continue, and then apply immediately. And then once the delete protection is done, you can go ahead and delete this database. You can remove, creating a final snapshot, and then say delete me, an acknowledgement fact that upon deletion everything will be lost. Click on delete and you are good to go. In this session, we are going to talk about the different RDS operation. So after creating what kind of operation going to perform and what kind of operation will be supported, and restore of DB version with previous restore point. So let's get started. So basically, once your RDS is running, you can see the status here, and also you can change the configuration. Here you can stop, delete, and also you can modify instance. So here in the modify status, here you can change, or we can say modify the whole things. Like if you want to change DB engine version, you can change. You can also change DB instance. Also you can change availability zone, storage purpose you can change, and you can increase your allocation size with default limit, which based on your availability and requirement, right? You can change the password and instant identifier. In security group, we can change and assign a new group. Public accessibility, here you can change like from no to yes or yes to no. It's based on your requirement, right? In database option, you can see port. Here you can change the port number. In backup section, you can change the backup configuration and details. Monitoring. So in monitoring, right now it's disabled. You can also enable your monitoring. You can change the configuration of maintenance also. So basically, even your instance is running, you can modify your instance configuration. So this all basically operation things. Now let's try to understand how to restore in previous state. Okay, so let's go to instance, and here if you select this and see here, you can see restore to point in time. So you can restore in specific time. So once I click here, configuration will be show here. So this is my last time of restoration. You can also choose the custom restore time here from specification based on your specific requirement time. Basically, when you do the restore in time, it will create the entirely new database fully from the scratch, right? You can also select the configuration from this new snapshot which creating from your restore point. So here you can see you want to change the license, you want to do the ability, so space identifier name. So you can do these things configuration also. So let's create new one here, and I'm just creating the port this default time, and given the name is my RDS1 with all default configuration I creating. So let's click on launch DB instance. So you can see here one new RDS is create here. So basically it is copy of your RDS on that particular time. So you can use that particular times copy based on your recommendation, because many times it's required for specific use cases like in QA, like in dev. Also sometimes for user specific data query, mainly requirement based on the different use cases. Now let's talk about RDS security, and the first topic I want to talk about is encryption. So we have at rest encryption, which is data that's not in movement, and there is possibility to encrypt the master database and the read replicas using AWS KMS, which is the key management service of AWS using AES 256 encryption. So when you do encryption, you define it at launch time, and if the master is not encrypted, the read replica cannot be encrypted. So there is a common scenario question of the exam as well. You can also enable transparent data encryption, also called TDE, for Oracle and SQL Server. Also, that provides you an alternative way of encrypting your database. Now, there is in-flight encryption, which is always going to be around SSL certificates, and they are used to encrypt data to RDS while in flight. So while being sent from your client into your database. For this, you provide SSL option with a trust certificates when connecting to the database, and you will have established an SSL connection. To enforce SSL, to make sure that all the clients must use SSL, if you are using PostgreSQL, there is a console parameter group you need to set called RDS.force SSL equals 1, and you are using MySQL within the database. You need to run this SQL statement called the grant usage onto MySQL user require SSL. Again, it's pretty obvious what it does. Just show you, no, PostgreSQL is a parameter group and MySQL is going to be SQL command within the database. So there are some RDS encryption operations that you should know, and the first one is, how do I encrypt an RDS backup? So something you should know is that if you have an unencrypted RDS database and you take a snapshot of it, then the snapshot itself will be encrypted. And similarly, if you take a snapshot of an encrypted RDS database, then by default all the snapshots are going to be encrypted by default all the time. And so what you can do is copy a snapshot, take a unencrypted into a crypted one. So if you take a snapshot of unencrypted RDS database and you copy it, you can create an encrypted version of the snapshot. Very easy, right? So now that brings us into how do we encrypt an unencrypted RDS database. Based on the information received, the first thing we do is that we create a snapshot of an unencrypted RDS database which will be unencrypted, and then we will copy the snapshot, and for the copied snapshot we'll enable encryption. So now we have a copied encrypted snapshot, and thanks to the encrypted snapshot we can restore the database from the encrypted snapshots, and that will be give us an encrypted RDS database. And then we just migrate all our application from the old encrypted RDS database to the new encrypted RDS database, and we will delete the old database, and that is some operation you should know. So very simple, you just see it once, and when it comes up in the exam you know about it. So now let's talk about network and IAM security. For network security, well, our RDS database are usually deployed within a private subnet, not a public one. So make sure not to expose your database to the World Wide Web. And RDS security works by leveraging security groups that you attach to your RDS instance. They are exactly the same concept as for EC2 instances, and it controls which IP or which security groups can communicate with RDS. For access management, which is user management and so on, and permission, you have IAM policies. They help you only control who can manage AWS RDS, so who can create a database, who can delete a database, who can create or read replica, and so on. And for traditionally connection to the database, you need to use a traditional username and password, okay, to log into the database, or as well see in the next slide. For just RDS MySQL and RDS PostgreSQL, you can use IAM based authentication. Okay. So bottom line is the database security usually is from within the database. Now let's talk about how we can connect to RDS using IAM authentication. So as I said, it is only for MySQL and PostgreSQL, and you don't need a password this time. You just need something called an authentication token, and that can be obtained directly using IAM and the RDS API calls. We will see this in the diagram in a second. And the authentication token, because it's short-lived, it has a lifetime of 15 minutes. So here's the example. We have our EC2 security group and our EC2 instance, and then we have our MySQL RDS database in RDS security group. So the EC2 instance will have something called an IAM rule, and we will see what that means when we get deep into IAM role for EC2. But the idea is that the EC2 instance, thanks to the IAM rule, is going to be able to issue an API call to the RDS service to get back an authentication token. And using the token, it's going to pass the token all the way to the while connecting to the MySQL database and make sure the connection is encrypted, and then it will connect securely to MySQL database. The benefit of this approach is that the network in and out must be encrypted using SSL. IAM is going to be used to centrally manage user instead of managing user from within the database. So it's more central type of authorization, and you can leverage IAM roles and EC2 instance profiles for easy integration. And as I said, we will see what IAM roles and EC2 instance profile as very soon. So summary of RDS security: you have encryption at rest, which is done only when you first create the database instance. And if it is unencrypted, you need to create a snapshot, copy of the snapshots to create encrypted it, and then you create a new database from the encrypted snapshot, and that will encrypt your database. And your responsibility is to check all the ports, IP security groups, inbound rules, free database security groups, or take care of all the in database user creation and permissions, or as we saw from before, managing through IAM for MySQL and PostgreSQL. Create a database with or without public access. So is it going to be in public subnet or in a private subnet? Ensure the parameter groups and the database is properly configured to only allow SSL connections, so making sure encryption is happening. And what is Amazon's web service responsibilities? Well, it is to make sure that you don't have SSH access, that you don't have to do a database patching, you don't have to do OS patching, and you don't have a way to look at underlying instance. Again, that is its responsibilities. So the RDS is a service offered to you, and you can leverage it or not, but to me, honestly, it is one of the best service of Amazon. So it makes a lot of sense to use RDS. Alright, that's it for this lecture. I will see you in the next lecture. So if you are new to this channel, subscribe and stay tuned for the upcoming video. Thank you for watching. Bye and have a nice day.